back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion in this lecture of the Federalist Papers. In the previous lecture, we focused on the Federalist Papers and questions of national security and defense. And in this lecture, we're going to be focusing on the debate about representation. In the previous lecture, we talked about the debate over national security and defense, where the Federalist side really had the better of the arguments, because only through a strong federal government do we have the ability to defend the entire nation. In this lecture, we're going to turn our attention more to the debate about domestic issues, where the Anti-Federalists are in some ways on stronger ground, and as we will see, a number of the major concerns that the Anti-Federalists had are borne out over the 200 plus years since the Constitution goes into effect. And we'll talk about some of that a little bit later. In essence, the Anti-Federalists are arguing that it is the states, rather than the central government or the federal government, that should have control over a number of issues, like the courts, over education, the protection of various freedoms and religious rights, and so on. And the states needed to have the ability to check the federal government, none of which they would have been able to do under the constitutional system as it was proposed. Now, Madison attempted to rebut some of those arguments by stating in Federalist 45 that it was improbable that the federal government would ever have to resort to internal taxes. I think it's fair to say he was wrong about that. But he also said that the states had the ability to check federal officials by way of elections and the selection of federal representatives that would meet their needs. But again, as we have seen over time, really the Anti-Federalists were right to have some of these concerns. Now, in Federalist Papers 9 and 10, Madison launched an attack on the traditions of the classic Republican model of government that so many of that era relied upon, but particularly the Anti-Federalists. And at the heart of his argument is kind of a shocking and new claim that it is not in small local democracies that the people's best interest will be defended, but rather in a massive national republic where the government lies at a great distance from many of its people and thus can be sort of objective and removed from the day-to-day entanglements that have traditionally dragged down Republican governments. And so Madison kind of expands his explanation by arguing that the classic sort of republics almost always seem to wind up in internal divisions or external warfare that tear them apart. And as Hamilton argued with his statement that people grow tired of democracy, participation in local government and community service grows tiresome and ultimately leads to friction and division. Ultimately, republics that rely on civic virtue inevitably suffer a great downfall. In Federalist 10, Madison addresses one of the great sources of downfall in traditional republics, what they called factions. Now, we in some ways may draw a correlation to modern-day political parties, and there are parallels to that. But essentially, factions are groups of citizens that lean towards their own interest in such a way that it threatens or impinges upon the rights of other citizens or doesn't work for the betterment of the whole community. Madison argues that the Constitution, as they have proposed it, would break and control the violence of faction. And he goes on to discuss this at some length. And Federalist 10 is one of the most important of the Federalist Papers because it does kind of prepare us or anticipate the rise of political parties. But what Madison explains is that the way the Constitution is devised is that kind of human nature's natural inclination towards groups and factions actually will play to the favor of the Constitution. As he writes, the new Constitution involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of the government. In other words, having a democratic system in which many of the people, not all, but many of the people are represented, they will all have to be aware of and look out for the interests of all these various factions, because no one group will have enough power to render all of the others meaningless. As he says, the majority having such coexistent passion or interest must be rendered by their number and local situation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. He calls this the tyranny of the majority. If we allow too many people of one sort to gather too much power in their control, then the whole idea of the democratic enterprise is going to be rendered useless. And so this kind of turns on its head the anti-federalist concern over a nation that is too large for democracy to work. By Madison's argumentation, actually, the larger the nation is, the better, because we will have more and more of these disparate interests, and no one group will be able to exert so much control as to eliminate the others or make them powerless. This idea of the tyranny of the majority. These arguments then play in turn into the debate over the idea of representation itself. For Madison and the Federalists, the people's best interest actually lie in layers of representation, more elected officials that will represent them, rather than direct democratic rule, which is what the Anti-Federalist favored, more direct participation by the people. So as Madison argues in Federalist 10 and in some of the other papers as well, the Federalists believe that the best solution lay in government in the hands of a capable, virtuous few. These well-educated sort of elites can be better trained and more knowledgeable than average people in knowing what the government needs to do to look out for the interest of the people. And so here we have one of the fundamental differences between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. When the Anti-Federalists speak of elected officials, they are typically distrustful and suspicious of their corruption. The Federalists put their faith in elected officials and are fearful and distrustful of the people themselves and the potential for kind of mob rule. This also plays into their debates and discussions about the two houses in Congress. The Anti-Federalists argue that the House of Representatives, which is elected directly by the people, should be sufficient to operate the legislative realm. Representatives should be elected annually, and they argue for a much larger House of Representatives. In other words, dividing up congressional districts into smaller and smaller pieces, having more representatives elected by smaller groups. Madison makes the counter argument that the House needs to have another balancing body in the legislative realm, which is the Senate. We're going to talk about the Senate more in the next lecture. And having a larger House of Representatives might lend itself to sort of a mob mentality of its own. And so he argues for limiting the size of the House. We're going to continue this discussion of the debate over the legislative branch in the next lecture.